So it is a very great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's distinguished visiting speaker, Ms. Channing Mavrellis. Channing is joining us from Global Financial Integrity, where she's a transnational crime analyst and an anti-money laundering specialist with substantial experience in the banking industry. Channing's the author of a 2017 report on criminal markets in the developing world. She also co-authored, also with GFI, a 2018 report on illicit cash flows connected with the illicit trade in wildlife and specifically great apes. Both of those, by the way, are available public access on GFI's website, so I encourage you to check those out. She's been kind enough to join us this afternoon for a discussion of the crucial but sometimes overlooked ways in which illicit trade functions in exactly the same way as licit businesses do. The title of her talk is The Business of Transnational Crime, and please join me in welcoming Channing Mavrellis.
Hi, so good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much to CINA for inviting me. I'll definitely say I always still get wicked nervous talking to everybody, but it's my pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to talk about something I find very, very interesting, and I think you guys do too, which is transnational crime. And to me, I love understanding how it works. I like, the TV show How It's Made. For me, that's how I want it to be with transnational crime. I want to see how it's broken down and how this works and how then we can kind of put it together, or break it apart, I should say, and combat it, not put it together. So just a little bit about Global Financial Integrity. We're a research, advocacy, and advisory organization. We're in Washington, D.C., and we focus on illicit financial flows and the systems that are used and abused to perpetuate them. So things like the financial system, which is abused, things like anonymous companies, which are used, different things like that. My role there is kind of the intersection of illicit financial flows, transnational crime, and trade. A lot of our work has always been very much focused on trade, particularly the measurement of illicit financial flows, or one way to measure an aspect of illicit financial flows. And for me, that kind of trade aspect, where you have a lot of overlap between legal and illegal sectors, is particularly interesting and very data rich as well. So today I will discuss the business of transnational crime with a focus on environmental crimes, and also the need to shift our focus from identity to actions when it comes to combating these crimes. Here are some figures from the report that Stu mentioned that came out in 2017, Transnational Crime in the Developing World. In 2011, we put this similar report together. My boss said, "What's up with these numbers now?" And I just got absolutely sucked into figuring out what the values of these markets are. And I should just give the caveat that obviously anything transnational crime related, anything illicit financial flow related, you're never going to pinpoint that dollar amount. This is putting this together is about expressing the orders of magnitude when it comes to these crimes, and really to illustrate why these crimes, and in my opinion, particularly transnational environmental crimes, are extremely dangerous, are damaging, and extremely serious as well. So as you can see, transnational crime is a business, and business is good. The groups engaged in transnational organized crime, from criminal networks and paramilitary groups to terrorist organizations and LLCs, are united by one common thread: motivation. Transnational crimes are intensely profit motivated. What is often overlooked is that the majority of the groups engaged in transnational crime are businesses in either action and/or corporate registration. Like their legal counterparts, these criminal enterprises operate for financial gain. They are organized commercial entities that provide goods and/or services to consumers. It just so happens that these goods and services are illegal or illegally obtained. Some of these groups are so well organized and well funded that they rival legitimate or multinational corporations. They literally embody the incorporation of transnational crime. This is not some isolated phenomenon. This is found all across criminal markets. From the origins of the Sicilian Mafia, which Diego Gambetta describes as a specific economic enterprise, an industry which produces, promotes, and sells private protection, to Mexican cartels, which control the cultivation and/or production of cannabis, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamines, up to global distribution and have also fluidly and successfully diversified into other markets, as well as those legal companies whose business is the antithesis of legitimate. To effectively combat transnational crime, we need to focus on actions, not identity, and target their financial drivers. We need to stop treating these crimes or these groups as distinct entities. We need to stop thinking of these groups in emotional terms of good versus evil. We need to remember that these are businesses. Most of the groups and networks engaged in transnational crime share many similarities with companies found on the Fortune 500 list. They are overwhelmingly profit motivated. They are always looking for a better way to do business. They closely follow and adopt new technological advances. They employ the best of the best gatekeepers, lawyers, accountants, and company formation agents. They have benefited considerably from globalization and the greater connectivity between buyer and seller. They diversify into new markets and products. Of the few major differences that separate them, most glaring are the products they deal in, the methods they use to obtain goods and services, and/or the violence used to obtain and maintain a competitive advantage. For transnational crimes that also have legal trades, particularly environmental crimes, there is a strong overlap between legal and illegal actors with a fine line separating them. I will focus my remarks today on the business of environmental crime, which is an area I've been exploring lately. The lion's share of focus for a long time has been on the overt crime and its obvious impact. So for example, with illegal fishing, the act of fishing illegally and the depletion of global fish stocks. What are missed are the latent impacts of these crimes and the other transnational and serious organized crimes that go hand in hand with them. Typically viewed as a matter of conservation or trade rather than criminality, this is to our detriment. There are legal trades for most of these items. Laundering is pervasive and often is only a piece of paper that separates legal from illegal. Environmental crimes are typically committed by legitimate companies rather than the traditional criminal organizations. Again, when we've been so focused on finding the bad guys, incorporation can blunt our perception and our responses. So first I'll talk about illegal fishing. So I'm happy to share these slides later on so you can see the detail a little bit more. But this is a great example from Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. They're a fabulous organization that does really, really great work that really lays out kind of the 101 of IUU fishing, or illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which according to GFI, we estimate illegal and unreported at $15.5 to $36.4 billion per year. It's a very basic operation, and really once the fish is out of the water, or timber, or minerals, or even wildlife, it's very hard to know if it was caught or harvested legal or illegally. Even more is the issue of jurisdiction. This isn't happening in one nation state. Sometimes it's happening in their territorial waters. Sometimes it's not. And a matter of jurisdiction and who is responsible for prosecution or who is able to actually prosecute these individuals becomes a problem. A perfect example is the Laundering. This is the ship, same ship, that it's been around for nearly 30 years, and since 2001 has operated under at least 11 different names and 9 flag states. Flag states are, with transnational crime, my mind is blown. Flag states are essentially like a tax haven in the essence, in the idea that they have no kind of major industry that's happening there, so what they can do to generate income is to either act as a flag state, act as a tax haven. That's where they earn their income. As a flag state, they are supposed to be responsible for the ships that are registered in their country or with their state. Many times they are not. For example, 2 primary flag states of convenience are Mongolia and Ecuador, which, if you know anything about geography, have no borders with water. I think Mongolia has 1 boat. It's like on a lake in the middle of the country. Not really great at policing illegal fishing. They're there for the money. These guys choose them because there's a very, very low risk of being interdicted, of being harassed, I should say. So The Laundering came into contact with the U.S. in 2006 when its owner, Antonio Vidal Pego, and his company Fadaler S.A., they pleaded guilty and were sentenced on charges involving the illegal importation of Patagonian and Antarctic toothfish, which you guys will know as Chilean sea bass. I know, they make it sound like really better than what it is. And I always think of Jurassic Park when I hear the Chilean sea bass, I'm not gonna lie. So Pego pleaded guilty to an obstruction of justice violation, and he was sentenced for 4 years term of probation. He was required to cease all involvement in the toothfish industry. You probably can guess how effective that was. He also had to pay a $400,000 fine. And then the company, Fadaler, which is one of many here, it was a Uruguayan company, pleaded guilty to false labeling, importation of illegally possessed fish, and attempted sale of those fish. So the company was ordered to complete a 4-year term of probation and cease all corporate activities and dissolve as a business. As you can see, Fadaler was one of many shell companies that was used by the Spanish syndicate to fish illegally with little intervention. And just several years later, the syndicate has been put out, there's been blacklisted by Interpol. There's Interpol purple notices which are put out. These are put out against ships for violations for things like piracy or illegal fishing. There's kind of a global hunt by Interpol and several nation states to really go after these ships. And there's actually several ships, the Yongding, the Kunlun, and the Songhua, that are owned by this, they call it the Galician Mafia, owned by this one kind of single beneficial owner. And there was a really concerted effort to go after it, led by Spain. And they actually were prosecuted in Spanish courts for the falsification of documents, money laundering, environmental crimes. But the Spanish Supreme Court actually ended up throwing out the case through lack of jurisdiction. They had caught the Laundering with a load of Patagonian toothfish in Vietnam. They had seized the toothfish. And after this ruling, the Spanish authorities had to pay the company back for destroying the Patagonian toothfish because the ruling went against them. So this is a huge issue with environmental crimes, is where does the jurisdiction fall? Who is responsible? And for companies and illicit operators like this, it's such a low risk, high reward operation. Who's gonna go after you? I mean, maybe you have to worry about Greenpeace. Greenpeace was very, very involved with some of these operations here, but that's about it. You don't have that one overarching entity that you have to worry about. That's one specific case. I think the delayed impact of illegal fishing, though, is one of the most serious. Illegal fishing frequently occurs in the waters of developing countries where the capacity, rule of law, and/or political will to monitor and enforce fishing regulations can be insufficient. Fishing is also a major industry and source of employment in most maritime developing countries. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that almost 60 million people are directly employed in fisheries and aquaculture, and the majority of these are in small-scale capture fishing operations in developing countries. So this is not small scale. This is large scale. And this is like a fleet together. Small scale is like a little artisanal boat. So these local artisanal and small-scale fishermen just can't compete with industrial long-distance fishing fleets that fish illegally. When local fishing stocks are depleted due to illegal fishing, the industrial fleets can move on. The locals are left behind to deal with consequences. Communities as well as individuals lose a major source of food, employment, and income. You are a fisherman with a boat, are skilled at sea with little to no work, and therefore income, due to depleted stocks. Where will you turn? When legitimate economic activities disappear, individuals may opt for illicit employment. They may turn to crime, drug trafficking, smuggling, piracy, and arms trafficking, to name a few that are common fisheries crimes. What will be the tipping point for a fisherman to begin to engage in fisheries crimes? What will be the tipping point for those that already engage in fisheries crime for supplemental income to make it their primary income? This is a scenario that's playing out. So we can see West Africa, huge, huge. It's 64% of China's illegal catch is happening in China. A lot of it's done illegally. And we can also see there's a huge amount of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. So this is a scenario that's playing out across the world, and to me this poses a huge security threat. Somalia is the poster child for the impacts of illegal fishing. When the government collapsed in 2001, obviously there's a lack of funding for resources like the Coast Guard to patrol the territorial waters. You had a huge influx of fishing vessels from Europe as well as from Asia that were fishing just rampantly in Somalia's waters, and there was also a large amount of just waste dumping. So the fish stocks were absolutely decimated. You have these kind of professionalized fleets there fishing, and you have smaller scale artisanal fishermen having to compete with them. And then all of a sudden, there's no more fish stocks. And we all know what happened in Somalia. It's a huge amount of piracy. It's actually now more piracy happening in the Gulf of Guinea than in Somalia. And the Gulf of Guinea has an extremely high level of illegal fishing. It's one of the highest rates in the world right now. So my question is, because of all the illegal fishing happening in the Gulf of Guinea, are we going to see the same situation play out right there? What's also popular in the Gulf of Guinea is cocaine flows from South America through West Africa into Europe. The same symptoms that benefit illegal fishing, so poor governance, weak rule of law, insufficient capacity, and lack of political will, also benefit all forms of other transnational organized crime. Drug trafficking typically engenders high levels of violence that can ultimately destabilize a country and divert precious resources to law enforcement. Will more smugglers mean more drug flows? So with that work, are fishermen going to turn to drug smuggling? With increased drug flows, will more organized criminal groups convert from providing logistics and smuggling to becoming actual wholesalers? Nigerian organized criminal groups have followed a very similar trajectory to Mexican cartels when it comes to cocaine trafficking. Originally, Mexican cartels were responsible just for the logistics of moving the cocaine through Mexico. Everything was done by the Colombian cartels. It was grown, it was produced, it was changed from coca plants to coca paste to cocaine hydrochloride, which is what is consumed. Mexico just provided that nice little transit route. And originally, actually, it was through the Caribbean. DEA came down hard. It started coming through the Mexican kind of land route there. Over time, Mexicans were getting paid, the Mexican cartels were getting paid in cocaine. And they started to get a larger and larger share of the cocaine market to where they actually became responsible, like I said, for production. They're not responsible for growing the coca plants. They are there for everything beyond. But when it comes to methamphetamine, when it comes to cannabis, when it comes to heroin, they are heavily involved. So they've now basically cornered the market in drug production and are responsible for so much of it. They've moved from kind of small-scale smugglers to key players. So you now see Nigerian organized criminal groups that have a foothold in South America. They've slowly transitioned along the same route. Originally, they were providing logistical support for South American cartels or Mexican cartels who were moving cocaine from South America through West Africa up into Europe. Slowly over time, these South American groups provided cocaine as a payment for the Nigerian services, and the Nigerian groups began to purchase cocaine themselves, directly from South American DTOs, drug trafficking organizations, both of which allowed Nigerian organized criminal groups to transition from smugglers to wholesalers. In fact, following along that same trajectory, the Nigerian authorities in 2016 arrested 4 Mexican nationals who were allegedly serving as consultants in the establishment of a large-scale meth lab in Nigeria that was capable of producing up to 4 tons of the drug each week. So this is exporting drugs and exporting expertise. Drug trafficking has played a huge role in destabilizing certain countries in West Africa, and the increased revenues earned by organized criminal groups from realizing a larger share of the market threaten to do even greater damage. Another great example of destabilize what can happen if people are out of jobs, like talking about the impact of illegal fishing on legitimate fishermen, what they turn to. This is, I was talking with Stu earlier, I love trade-based money laundering, or I should say, understanding trade-based money laundering. And I really encourage you to think of, we talk about TBML, I encourage you to think of it as money laundering through trade. So this is a way of laundering money using trade, often to move value. You're moving value through products, not actually physically sending the money. Same idea of money laundering through real estate. You're cleaning the money through trade. So this is a really perfect example of trade-based money laundering with the Lebanese Canadian bank. This happened several years ago. So you have right here, start with Colombia. So you have cocaine in Colombia. It's getting sent to Africa at the same time as used cars from the US are getting shipped to Africa, particularly West Africa. Used cars and used everything are a huge import in Africa, but particularly used cars. So once in Africa, the drugs are then forwarded up to Europe, and the cars remain in Africa, they're sold. Those monies are intermingled together, so you kind of clean things up. You've padded the car sales with the drug sales money. And the money is then moved through exchange houses in the Middle East, particularly Lebanon, presenting them as actual, legitimate currency exchanges. And then the exchange house's accounts at Lebanese Canadian Bank, it was moved and deposited into the Lebanese Canadian Bank. From there, money was diverted to Hezbollah. Money was sent back to the US to purchase more cars and then just perpetuate the cycle. And then you also have money going to China in what is commonly known as the black market peso exchange. This is a great, great way to launder money because you're not moving money at all. You're moving products and you're moving value. So Chinese exporters are sending imports to South America, where when they're sold, those proceeds are then given back to the drug dealers. So you've moved the value of exports, so let's say toys, from China. When they're sold, that money then goes back to traffickers. It's extremely hard to detect. It's trying to find a needle in a stack of needles is kind of how it's described, because of the sheer volume of trade that's actually going on. Being able to pick out a particular transaction that's fraudulent or that's highly suspicious is very, very difficult. Speaking of the Gulf of Guinea, I was at a conference on wildlife trafficking and met a man from Nigeria who works on raising awareness with the fishermen around Lagos, talking about fishermen in the Gulf of Guinea. Due to illegal fishing, depleted stocks have driven local fishermen to turn to poaching manatees for both parts and live animal trade, and they're typically shipped to Asia. If you Google it, you can actually see them. They'll fill a room partway full of water and put some manatees in it. It's the strangest looking thing you've ever seen. I don't know. I never get wildlife trafficking. It's absolutely crazy. So this is one of the things to think about when you talk about environmental crimes. You see the active engagement of legitimate businesses that are really bringing up huge security threats for the region. There's knock-on effects that aren't just a matter of losing natural resources, losing food stocks. We're talking about the perpetuation, the increase of additional, more serious transnational crimes that can really have a large impact on a region. It can have impacts both on security in terms of from traditional transnational crime groups, as well as to terrorist financing as well. So next is illegal logging. Again, great little diagram of how this works. So illegal logging is estimated at from 52 to $157 billion annually. This is the epitome of a low-risk, high-reward crime to get involved in. Like illegal fishing, a huge number of people, 1.6 billion people, rely on force for their livelihood. It's not a victimless crime. Like the vast exclusive economic zones in illegal fishing, the remote locations and an immense size of many forested areas also makes it very difficult for authorities to effectively monitor logging concessions and prevent illegal logging. Geographically, illegal logging principally occurs in Southeast Asia, Central Africa, and South America. An estimated 50 to 90% of timber from these regions is acquired through illegal practices. So illegal logging uses similar techniques to trade misinvoicing. So that's the intentional manipulation of a trade invoice, so like an export certificate or an import certificate, to disguise the quantity, quality, or here like species, value, or origin in order to launder the timber. So to make it just like money, you have to make it from dirty to clean. For example, logging operations might over-invoice legal timber quantities. So they're going to say they've produced more timber in order to introduce illegal timber. So they say, we've produced 50 tons of legal timber. Really, they've produced 30, and they're going to launder in 20 of dirty timber. So they've provided themselves with a bit of cover. But then afterwards, they're going to under-invoice the official sale amount. So they're going to go, when they sell it, they're going to say, actually, we only sold 15 tons of timber. And that way, they have more room to harvest more timber because they haven't met their total quota. There's a million great ways to do this. And by great, I mean like sneaky and conniving and not super good for logging. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes, the UNODC, formal business enterprises operating through fraudulent methods are responsible for the majority of illegal logging. China is a major transit hub for illegal timber due to its role in processing and manufacturing. It's actually the leading importer and exporter of timber. So here's a nice little local case that actually happened not too far away. It happened here in Virginia. So this happened just a few years ago. This is Lumber Liquidators. You probably have seen all of their flyers. You get the mailings. It's really obnoxious. So what was happening was oak was harvested from Russia, in the Russia Far East, where it's known that an estimated 50% of the logging there is conducted illegally. So we're already talking like a really high-risk transaction. It was sent to be processed in China, and the Environmental Investigation Agency did a really great report which exposed lumber liquidators, and that's how they found out how they were doing business. So this was one way. So lumber liquidators knew the timber was coming from a high-risk area, and they didn't do any due diligence. So that's one way they were operating legally. So you kind of have the passive, like, I didn't know better kind of actions. And then you have the active illegality of falsely declaring the country where it was harvested. So they were saying that timber from Germany, they were saying they declared it as country of origin as Germany for Mongolian oak, so Mongolian species from Germany. They declared lumber as Welsh oak rather than from Mongolia. They actively, fraudulently manipulated invoices upon the import into the United States. So the import of illegally harvested timber. So for example, in Russia, one kind of timber harvesting certificate was passed around so much that when put together, all the number of times it was used, it was more than 800% of the allowable or possible harvest amount. So this kind of stuff happens all the time. It's a matter of really taking the time and then really exposing the trade and understanding what's going on. In total, lumber liquidators paid a fine of $13 million, which seems very, very small to me. And this, to me, kind of falls along the lines of what you see with some of these big banks and the fines that they're getting. It's a drop in the bucket in terms of the revenues that they normally receive. So in terms of punitive damages, there's no punitive damages for lumber liquidators except for maybe reputational. And I think this case, though, really didn't get too far outside kind of the environmental, arena in terms of public knowledge. So even then, the issue of reputational, hits is not too bad. There's also this kind of issue of low threshold. We talked about environmental crimes as being really serious because there's a low threshold for government corruption. So let me introduce you to Abdul Tayyib Mahmood. He is touted as the richest man in Malaysia, though he wasn't always so. He was the chief minister of Sarawak, so it's this little region down here on the island of Borneo, from 1981 to 2014. And he was the governor, he's currently the governor of Sarawak since 2014. So over 30 years, nearly 90% of Sarawak's rainforest, so his whole time in power, has been logged while under his control, which includes areas inside national parks and protected indigenous lands. While in control, there was a very high number of cases involving breaches of native customary rights to land, so the ability of native peoples to claim land or land ownership, often in relation to palm oil plantations. In his position as chief minister and governor, he had control of the logging permits and land concessions and was able to illegally structure state commercial activities to benefit him. He is a part owner of 3 major Malaysian timber companies. Talk about conflict of interest. He has been accused, or these companies have been accused of a myriad of criminal acts, including corruption, nepotism, bribery, illegal logging, human rights abuses, timber laundering, money laundering, and more. So this governor of a small developing country has in total known interests in nearly 400 companies in 25 countries. So you can see how he has this kind of the use of extended families, or what we would call, he's a politically exposed person. It's somebody that's in a position of power due to politics generally, who is at a higher risk of being involved in corruption or being involved in maybe criminal acts. And so for the banking industry, for the financial industry, for business, this is somebody that is accorded higher risk levels and must have higher, what we would say enhanced due diligence when it comes to understanding who they are and who their networks are. So it's him plus his spouse. He has 4 children. He has, Tayyip has 9 siblings. He has 7 cousins. So altogether, he has, his fingers through this huge network. He has all of these companies. He has Malaysian companies, he has foreign companies, he has high-end hotels, timber and construction companies. He has a global financial interests everywhere. So there's major commercial real estate holdings in the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. In Canada, he was accused of funneling proceeds of corruption, so more than $250 million into Canadian real estate. And I have to say, real estate, again, is a great way to launder money. You've heard more and more about this issue, particularly with the geographical targeting orders that are happening in the US. I'm happy to talk about more of that later in Q&A. It's an issue in London where it's so bad. The Russian investment of dirty proceeds in London, they're calling it Londongrad because of all the money in real estate. In Canada, particularly in Vancouver, it has jacked up the real estate prices to the point where it's impossible for local residents to actually purchase homes, but all of these homes are sitting empty. So you also have the problem of people locally not being able to find housing because there's no real estate, there's no rental properties available. So you ask kind of what's the big deal? I mean, obviously we say he's very involved in a lot of criminal activities. How does this impact the U.S.? Well, one of the properties that he is a landlord for is in Seattle, and it happens to be the FBI office in Seattle, where they have their headquarters or their local office. This has been known for like 8 years, and nothing has been done about this. So this isn't a matter of this bad guy. It's a question of security. The proceeds from illegal logging and corruption have allowed him to invest far beyond the timber industry. Palm oil, agriculture, communications, shipping, media, tourism, real estate. He is the epitome of a politically exposed person, and he's not an outlier when it comes to this. And for us not to care about the impact of these people, particularly when there's a huge discussion going on about the investment of foreign money into countries or the foreign interest kind of navigating or, let's say, diverting, let's say, election proceeds in a country. This is something that we need to be more concerned about. So illegal mining, like illegal logging and fishing, it falls across the spectrum. So you have just straight up legal mining. It's clear, you're following all the rules, you have legal title to the property, it's great. There's criminal mining, very black and white, being connected by organized criminal groups, OCGs, or armed groups like guerrilla groups or paramilitary groups. It's people, trespassing at mining sites and mining there illegally. And you have this informal mining. So technically informal mining falls under illegal mining. It's definitely a bit of a gray area, particularly when it comes to countries where like land ownership and property rights isn't concrete like it is here in the US. So when it comes to like native rights or traditional rights to land, it's not perfect. It's hard to talk about. When I talk about illegal mining, I am including informal mining. It's not a commentary on it being illegal or not. It's just the way I'm discussing it. So illegal mining, UN Environment, formerly UN Environment Program, estimates it to be $12 to $48 billion a year. It's not just a matter of robbing natural resources. It has numerous associated crimes: human rights abuses, environmental degradation, deforestation, pollution, fishing or food sources. So it's not a matter of just stealing resources. The impacts are much, much deeper and greater. So in Latin America, this is again from Global Initiative, great work they did looking at illegal mining in Latin America. As you can see, it's extremely lucrative, and often like timber, you can see in certain countries, it's almost the entire mining sector is criminal. Also in Latin America, narcos or narco traffickers really have favored laundering drug proceeds through illegal mines and illegally mined gold. So illegal gold mining in Latin America, in Colombia in particular, is actually more profitable than drug trafficking nowadays. So in 2014, 1 kilo of cocaine was worth $2,500, while 1 kilo of gold was $30,000 to $40,000. So you have the government actively doing crop eradication, actively pursuing coca cultivation, or you have, let's say a felony, or you have illegal mining, which gets some attention and is a misdemeanor. So if you're the average person who's looking for a way to earn income, this is a great way. Again, not advocating it, but this is where you see such huge involvement of people and a great way to launder money through it. And why should we care in the US? About 75% of US gold imports come from Latin America. In 2016, the Colombian legal mining operations officially produced 8 tons of gold. However, the country exported 64 tons of gold. This is coming from unlicensed gold sales, unlicensed mining, smuggled illegal gold from neighboring countries, and the like. You also have a huge diversification of actors in illegal mining. So you have participation by former FARC, by the ELN, the backroom groups, the bandas criminales, groups like Clan del Golfo and the Yorubanos. They're getting direct income, they're getting passive income. They'll also use phantom gold shipments, so they'll say they're shipping gold to the US, but they're not shipping anything. They'll use it as a way to send money. So think about this, if I can draw this out. If I'm sending somebody involved in illegal gold mining or in narco trafficking, if I'm exporting gold from Colombia, so I'm sending, let's say, 1 ton of gold to the US, there should be a corresponding payment from the US to Colombia for that gold. Now, let's say I don't send anything, but I'm still saying I sent gold. Nobody is going through and opening up those containers and checking. So you can use narco proceeds in the US, send them back to Colombia, and repatriate the proceeds from drug trafficking in the US back to Colombia. This is why trade is such a great way, is the sheer volume of it. You can't identify every single illegal transaction. So that's another great way, or difficult way, to launder money. So another example, and I love this quote: "Gold has become the secret ingredient in the criminal alchemy of Latin America. Latin American narco traffickers who make billions turning cocaine into clean cash by exporting the metal to Miami." I mean, this is really what's allowing a lot of this to happen. So there's a particular case with a company called NTR Metals. They are a subsidiary of a group called Elemental. It's a US company. So in just 1 year alone, this company, NTR Metals, bought $1 billion worth of Peruvian gold. Overall, it was $33.6 billion. They knowingly purchased it from narco sources. And in turn, NTR Metals was supplying major suppliers like Apple and Tiffany's. And what they would do is, so you have the proceeds from drug trafficking in Colombia. You're investing it into just bulk gold. You're purchasing gold, or you're investing it into the mining operations. You're then selling it on to these front or shell companies, and you're just passing them on. The shell companies create a layer of insulation between the person doing it and then anybody who might want to be investigating this layer on. So every layer, it's harder and harder to get more detail and find out who's doing what. From there, you have seemingly legitimate, gold supplies, and you're shipping them either to the U.S., particularly to Miami. The Miami Herald Miami Times did a really great 5-part piece about this. I recommend it. They're going to Switzerland, or they're going to other high-demand gold countries like in the Gulf or in India. So they used front companies, so like these shell companies here. They used false U.S. customs declarations. They bribed Peruvian customs officials. Once the government started catching on, instead of going Peru to the U.S., they would export the gold from Peru to Bolivia or Ecuador and then to the U.S. And then they would move from Colombia to the U.S. And then they would use Colombian free trade zones, or they would just straight up smuggling it. And this is a legitimate company in the U.S. actively engaged in obviously just using, helping to launder basically the proceeds of crime, as well as, illegal mining, allowing that to happen too. So like the major banks, again, there were like 3 employees who were, pointed out as these are the people who are perpetrators who are doing this. They were the only ones who knew about this. They received about 6 to 7 years in jail. The company was fined $15 million, which seems extremely light considering they laundered $3.6 billion of gold. So some commentary on what's appropriate when it comes to sentencing. Something else to keep in mind with a lot of these environmental crimes, and I'm talking about just one particular here, but in all of these, there's a huge overlap with human trafficking. This is the Madre de Dios region in Peru. As of 2012, 500,000 people in Peru relied on illegal mining for their employment. So this isn't just kind of like a small-scale industry. This is a major part of the economy. Every year, Peru loses an estimated $450 million in lost tax revenue from undeclared profits from informal and illegal mining. So this is something, when we talk about illicit financial flows, this is money leaving the country. This is money that's not staying in Peru that could be used to improve the country in terms of development, providing infrastructure, providing housing, providing healthcare, providing schools. It's not going towards that. It's leaving the country. So the rise in gold prices caused a migration from the Andean region of Peru to Madre de Dios, as well as people from Brazil and Bolivia. So in the Madre de Dios region, it's estimated that about 97% of the mining there is illegal. It's a lot of deceptive recruitment practices, and this is very, very common in illegal fishing too. You're told incorrectly of what you're going to be doing, where you'll be doing it, how long you'll be doing it, the conditions that you'll be doing, what pay you will receive. There will be kind of unfree recruitment where you will be recruited to engage in mining. You're saying, hey, come on, but since I found you this job, you need to pay me any money. So you already start off in debt. So you owe a debt to somebody. So you have a huge amount of indentured labor, of slave labor going on, of debt bondage too. Debt bondage is very common. And so, for example, here in mining, workers are recruited. They will be given advances or startup capital to purchase tools or equipment or supplies. And they will be construed as gifts for them to help them start out. And then once they get there, they now have a debt to pay off, and they haven't even earned any money yet. So, for example, a 90-day contract in a situation like this could take 8 months or 9 months or even 2 years to fulfill or pay off the debts. So again, this isn't a matter of the government losing some resources, which is important. This has really, really deep impacts throughout. And then another issue is just the huge amount of sex trafficking in this region too. With remote camps, with remote communities, services often spring up to cater to the workers. So it makes it very difficult for people to police and for people to escape. So women and girls are trafficked by deception and sold by their family. There's a very high level of trafficking by their own family, particularly where family members will sell their daughters off for additional income. Madre de Dios is pretty bad. Just one region, it's known as Delta 1 in Madre de Dios, up to 60% of sex workers are minors. The level of environmental damage and the human rights and abuses that are seen in Madre de Dios, they're on scale with the issue of Africa's blood diamonds, but there's such much lower visibility. There's no movie made about it. There's no huge global movement for getting this to stop. So a lot of this is a matter of connecting it to issues that people care about. A lot of it's branding, about talking about it in a certain way. Wildlife trafficking. So Stu talked about a report we did last year looking at great apes. Very niche area, I will admit. So we wanted to understand the trade, particularly financially, of how the sale of both bushmeat as well as live animals worked in terms of finances. So we're talking about chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans. So what I did was just kind of explain the report. There's obviously not a lot of literature about this out here. So I reached out to about 100 different people and organizations. I did about 40 to 50 interviews with people and tried to plot out the key roles in this supply chain and also how much each person made on average. So I'm just showing the chimpanzee one. If you go to our website, you can see for each of the other species. But for every species, at the dealer level, they make the highest amount of profit. I mean, you can see the poacher makes next to nothing. And as you go higher and higher, even though this foreign wholesaler, the guy who's going to sell it to like the final buyer, he's obviously making the most in terms of, maybe he's getting $40,000. It's these domestic and international dealers that are making the greatest profit. And these really, it helps to identify who the key players are in the supply chain. Wildlife crime to me is very, very interesting because there's a variety of species, there's a variety of drivers going on. A lot of the focus has traditionally been on ivory, has been on rhino horn. Pangolins got lucky, their profile got elevated really well. Big cats are an issue, we're talking about timber. But when we talk about the volume of what's happening, it's actually often birds and reptiles that are laundered into the legal trade. Again, laundering illegally caught animals into the legal trade. So one case we looked at, and this is from a really great organization called the Eagle Network. They do just phenomenal work in Africa on interrupting these networks, involved the Dumboya Pet Company. So you have a legal business that is operating as a legal pet export company. You have this great little network here, and you have Bala Dumboya, who is the owner of this network. And then unrelated to him, you have Ansuman Dumboya. Ansuman Dumboya is a government official in Guinea. And so there's this global convention, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of wild fauna and flora. And so whenever you have highly endangered species, there's 3 lists that they classify these animals on. So there's Appendix I, II, and III. 1 are like highly, highly endangered species. All of the great apes, elephants, tigers, things like that. Appendix II is kind of a lesser degree of endangerment. And Appendix III are species that are not internationally classified as endangered, but a particular country might themselves perceive the animal to be endangered and ask other nations to help support them in their efforts to protect the animal. So for Appendix I species, which are chimpanzees, you have to have a certificate. The CITES certificate has to be issued in order to export and import this animal. And so what was happening was Ansuman Dumboya, unrelated to Bala, is the person in Guinea who is responsible for issuing these certificates. And so they were bribing him. He would get up to $5,000 per certificate to write these. And so within like a 2-year period for just chimpanzees, just going to China, it was about 100 chimpanzees over a 2-year period going to China. First off, the problem is, let me show this to you. So here's a CITES certificate. You can see here it says pan-troglodyte, scientific name for chimpanzees. I, or 1, so it's Appendix I and C, which means it's captive bred. So technically, Appendix I species cannot be sold commercially. They can go to like a zoo, they can go for maybe scientific reasons, but they can't be sold commercially unless they're captive bred. And that has its own kind of details there. It has to be like the 3rd generation raised in captivity. It has to meet certain criteria. So you have this guy, Ansuman Dumboya, writing all these CITES permits from Guinea, stating that these are captive bred animals when there is not a captive breeding facility anywhere in Africa. And so a significant number of these permits were written. Like I said, 100 chimpanzees were sent over. There's 2 major types of the smuggling of the wildlife. So this, what we call, would be technical smuggling. This is called the sea scam in CITES terminology. You're declaring it as captive bred so you can commercially sell them when they're not. So you're not lying about the actual movement of the animal. You're saying, yeah, I have the chimpanzee here, but you're technically smuggling it by modifying what we would say is maybe an invoice or a permit. Then you have the physical smuggling. So what you would do is you would obtain permits for less endangered species. So in one example, they had parrots and some mongoose, and they would put the chimpanzees in the same container, but then hide them. So you have a shipment of animals. We have the permits for these animals. Everything looks great. And so that's how you can physically smuggle the animals out of the country. And how are they getting payment? Through HSBC. This is great information. It's really hard to come by. Again, this was Eagle Network. And because they were laundering these animals, because they were stating that they had been captive bred, there was absolutely no reason to hide the transfer of money. So you have clearly here Bala Dumboya's name. He's getting a payment for, this is $40,000, $50,000 for a chimpanzee. Has all of his information on here. There's no need to use an anonymous company. There's no need to have layers or use like a straw man. When you have a legitimate business, a great front, so this little Dumboya Pets company, this is a great way to move products with little oversight. So kind of just to wrap up some final thoughts. We're talking about environmental crime, and for me this is a serious crime. I talked about this earlier. So part of what makes drug trafficking a serious organized crime is security threats it poses. We need to recognize that environmental crimes also present a security threat. It threatens human security, food security, natural security, economic security, and national security. Just because there aren't bodies in the street doesn't mean they are any less dangerous or impactful. Environmental crimes are a major driver, financial driver of conflicts and a funding source for non-state armed groups and more increasingly traditional organized crime groups. Environmental crimes are purely profit motivated versus just an avoidance of trade-related legislation. You look at lumber liquidators, this isn't, oh, I just don't want to pay some taxes. This is active involvement in this crime. This cannot be conducted, environmental crimes cannot be conducted without the commission of other offenses. You can't just illegally log and be done with it. There's other offenses going on. You see issues of human trafficking, the forced labor involved, there's money laundering, there's customs fraud. It doesn't happen in isolation. There are generational impacts on both people and on the land in terms of the illegal mining. They're using mercury to do the gold, like to mine the gold. And that's getting all put into the land, it's going into the river. So now you can't plant crops, you can't fish there. You can't drink the water. This isn't just a one-time thing. And then there's also a lot of associated violence, particularly the human trafficking that I mentioned. So I guess my question for you is, can a company that repeatedly engages in illegal fishing or illegal mining or illegal logging or wildlife crime, can it be considered an organized criminal group just because it's incorporated? I think there's been this really big disconnect that just because of incorporation, that link to criminality, to straight up criminal organization or identity hasn't been established. Well, according to the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, an organized criminal group is a structured group of 3 or more people existing for a period of time, acting in concert with the aim of committing one or more serious crimes, which, according to UNODC, is a crime with a penalty of more than 4 years imprisonment, and in order to obtain directly or indirectly a financial or other material benefit. Many of the companies and operators engaged in environmental crime clearly meet 1, 2, and 4. So it's a structured group, existing for a period of time, financial benefit. If the only point of debate in all of this is whether environmental crimes are serious crimes, and literally like you have Indonesia begging the UN to recognize illegal fishing as a serious crime, as a transnational crime. So if it's only a matter of considering these serious crimes, I think the impacts discussed today really show that it should be treated as such. Traditional law enforcement responses by governments have met with limited success, particularly in regards to environmental crimes and the war on drugs. Frequently, these efforts focus on the interdiction of participants and products, looking at identity versus actions. Now let's consider if we were to use these same methods to try and shut down a legitimate company. So Apple is a household name. It's a major multinational corporation with global revenues of more than $265 billion in 2018. And I would bet that most of us in here have at least one Apple product. So one popular tactic employed by law enforcement is to go after the leaders, the heads of criminal organizations, what's known as a decapitation technique. Now, it's undeniable that Steve Jobs was a visionary leader and instrumental to the creation of Apple. Yet his death had very little impact on the company, and the brand and its products were well established and in strong demand. With criminal groups moving away from hierarchical, vertically integrated organizations, this technique does not have the same type of impact it used to have. A particularly good recent example would be Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. The Sinaloa cartel still stands strong despite his arrest, prosecution, and conviction. In addition, there are many instances of criminal groups, particularly gangs in Latin America, whose leadership has been imprisoned with minimal impact to the group's activities. The leadership, such as that of Mara Salvatrucha, is still able to control and even expand operations from within prison. Indeed, Incite Crime, another excellent resource, I should say, has actually referred to Latin American prisons as incubators of organized crime. So in some instances, leadership decapitation can actually lead to an increase in violence, as rival criminal organizations perceive the power vacuum as an opportunity to expand their territory and operations, and hence their profits, inciting violence between groups as well as the government. Now, another technique, very often law enforcement will also go after the low-level participants, so the street-level dealers, the poachers, the informal miners, or even sex trafficking victims. But think about trying to shut down Apple by arresting employees in the stores. So you go into the Georgetown Apple store and you arrest all of the employees selling Apple products there and all of your little Apple, geniuses and stuff like that. You've removed the immediate, the people that are responsible for the direct sale or acquisition of goods, but this is a temporary win. There's a legion more willing to assume their place. These people are there largely because it's necessary in terms of survival versus, they're there not because they want to be a drug trafficker or they want to be a drug dealer, but what it affords them. I'm not saying everybody's, some sob case, but like, this is, a lot of these people are doing it because they have no economic alternatives. And so to just get rid of them and assume that you've solved the problem, there's many more that are going to come right in and take over this position. Another common enforcement method is to go after the product, so from dime bags of cannabis to tons of pangolin scales. Like many of the goods trafficked by organized crime groups, there is a considerable demand for Apple's products. products that would show a strong price inelasticity. But can you imagine thinking that a good way to force Apple out of business is by seizing every iPhone or iPad? It would be an exercise in futility. There are billions of Apple products out there and billions more being manufactured. Despite all of the similarities with business, transnational crime has frequently been viewed and combated through a moral lens that overlooks basic economic and business principles and ignores actions over identity. The approach will never produce meaningful results. Now, I'm not saying that we should ignore the people and the products, but so far these methods have not proven to be sufficient in seriously curtailing transnational crime. Targeting the superficial symptoms of transnational crime, rather than attacking the underlying system that supports it, will never produce long-lasting, substantive results. Transnational crime is greater than the products and people involved. It is a systemic problem. So what is one thing that businesses, legal or illegal, need to survive? They need money and they need access to it. So at Global Financial Integrity, we believe that financially motivated crimes require financially oriented responses. When it comes to the money generated by transnational crime, the conversation has often stalled on the point that these revenues line the pockets of criminals. Talking about, oh, they can afford that beautiful house or that fancy sports car, of the luxurious life they get to lead. What is often not mentioned is that, like legitimate businesses, organized criminal groups also reinvest their profits back into their businesses, improving and expanding operations, as well as diversifying into other illegal activities. We need to see going after the money as more than just preventing criminals from enjoying their profits. It is an essential part of attacking the funding that allows these groups to keep operating. Unlike their legal counterparts, these groups rely on access to the financial system in order to conduct business. Governments need to ensure that strong anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, so AML/CTF laws and regulations are in place, and more importantly, effectively enforced. The same diligence that has been used to understand and combat drug trafficking organizations, particularly the method of following the money, should be employed to fight all transnational crime. By following the money, we can deprive criminal enterprises of its critical funding. In addition, following the movement of these illicit financial flows will help map out criminal networks, identifying the key figures that are directing and financing the operations. We talk about the resource curse as the failure of resource-rich developing countries to benefit fully from their natural resources, timber, fisheries, extractives, and wildlife. That they suffer from poor economic growth, conflict, weak governance, and poor development. But this is only half the picture. We are only looking at where these resources are coming from. We aren't considering where the resources and associated financial flows are going to. I would argue that the illicit financial flows stemming from these crimes, much of which ends up in the West and the US, are a resource curse to us when these criminal proceeds permeate our economy, often anonymously. As our report points out, the global shadow financial system, things like trade misinvoicing, anonymous shell companies, and secrecy jurisdictions, which the US is one of, are used to the benefit of all transnational crime. Getting behind strong AML/CFT laws and enforcement, the collection of beneficial ownership information, the increased scrutiny of secrecy jurisdictions, and increased interagency data sharing, these are things that all of us here should be behind. These are not just issues related to fighting tax evasion or promoting financial transparency. Advocating for these crimes will have an impact on all transnational crime. Thank you. Thank you.